Hey VC, Jamie here. Hope you guys are all doing well. And yeah, it's been a while. Quite a few changes in my life, I would say, since I last made a video. I'm not actually sure how long it's been now, it might be nearly a year or so. However, things are good. I am in the midst of retraining, actually, change of career for me. Training to become a psychotherapist. And I'm also doing a postgraduate degree as well in musicology at the same time. And I'm still doing a full-time job. So things have been pretty busy, but I'm still finding plenty of time to listen to records, read about records, write about records a little as well, actually. So yeah, enough of my life story. That's probably not what you're here for. Let's get into it and talk about some music. Alright, so first up here is a fantastic loft jazz session from the guitarist Michael Gregory Jackson. This record is called Clarity. In fact, I think full title is Clarity, Circle, Triangle, Square. And this came out on his own record label, Bija Records, in 1977. Also featuring David Murray, Oliver Lake, and wonderful trumpet player Wadada Leo Smith. Now this is in that free loft scene, but without a lot of maybe the heavier blowing that people might associate with a good chunk of the stuff that appears on the Wildflowers compilations on Douglas Records, if you're familiar with those. Yeah, this is a really kind of pensive, thoughtful, almost like gestural record, really. And I love the opening track, Clarity, on here. Jackson kind of sets the scene with his acoustic guitar, the horns coming underneath, and this really kind of beautiful chord-like choruses that he plays together underneath his guitar. And then out of nowhere his voice just appears, and it's just the most kind of ethereal, gorgeous, haunting little tone poem, really. It's not all relaxed, pastoral. There is some pretty heavy playing at times. But for me, that first track kind of characterizes the best qualities of this record in a sense. It's kind of like restrained drama, if you like. And there's one piece on here as well. How do you pronounce this? Preluionti? That's definitely not how you say it. But it's a solo guitar piece, and for anyone who's into that kind of guitar solo, American primitive stuff, be that John Fahey, Sandy Bull, that sort of thing, that track I mentioned is really a gorgeous, like, tour de force example of that kind of music, but filtered through the loft scene. And the music that was being played at that time is a really amazing track. And it's recorded live as well, so you kind of hear the audience reaction afterwards, and they are just stunned, as you would be. So definitely check this out if you don't know it. It's Michael Gregory Jackson, Clarity. Alright, up next we're going to stick with a little more stuff from the loft scene, and recently I've been playing this a lot. It's a fantastic record by the New Life Trio. This is Visions of the Third Eye. New Life Trio featuring Steve Reed on drums, and this is on his record label Mystic Sound. Also the great David Wortman on bass, hugely underrated, under-recorded bass player. And then finally on guitar, Brandon Ross, who really is he's like the secret sauce on this session to me. Originally, Reed wasn't supposed to appear on this at all. It was supposed to be a trio with a violin player who then couldn't make the session, had to cancel it, so Reed stepped in at the last minute. And what you have on here is this fantastic mixture of like freedom and pulse. It's something Steve Reed does really, really well, I think, on any record that he appears on. At the bedrock of everything he does, there is always groove, there's always pulse. Doesn't matter how out the music goes, he's always able to just bring it back in there in this really fantastic way. Yeah, so the music on here, it kind of shifts and dances around a lot. Reed almost like, in some ways he's responding to Brandon Ross. Ross, as I mentioned, he's a secret sauce on this. He is predominantly playing acoustic guitar, very, very free-flowing, but at the same time he's kind of jumping around from idea to idea, and Reed's following him or occasionally steering him in a different direction. So you'll find tracks where the pulse that's under there almost reverses itself, or it turns 180 degrees. Quite often can catch you off guard, especially on is it Egypt Rock? Yeah, Egypt Rock and Chinese Rock, those two tracks especially have that kind of shifting rhythm thing. Yeah, I mean, the track that really stands out on this, or at least was the one that kind of gave first attention to this album after like 20 years of obscurity, is Empty Streets, which kicks off the record. And it's only 2.5 minutes. It's like a little fragment. And it fades in and it fades out too. And it's almost like you sort of catch it in the middle. You catch the music in the middle of it happening. Brandon Ross's voice comes in as another vocal accented track. And it's kind of ethereal, really. I mean, there is a really haunting quality to it. It sounds late night. And when I hear it, it's almost as if I'm stood in like an alleyway and the band sort of comes past. You catch a glimpse of them down the alleyway and then they pass by again. It's kind of got that quality to it, that ghostliness. And yeah, in some ways it's almost like you're hearing the memory of the song rather than the song itself, if that makes any sense. Just, as I say, that sort of ghostly, ethereal element to it. But yeah, there's plenty of like aggressive outplaying on this as well. But there's something about the instrumentation, acoustic bass, drums, acoustic guitar for most of it, that just keeps the edge of it slightly in check. Like I think even for people that struggle with kind of freer music, I think this is still pretty accessible. There's a reissue of this. I think Soul Jazz put it out. There's another label put out a reissue of it pretty recently as well, so it's easily tracked down now, I think. But yeah, great stuff, great Steve Reed, and as I say, his like rhythmic work on this is so good. I mean, you can tell his two big influences as a drummer were Art Blakey and Philly Joe Jones. You absolutely get that in his playing. Muscular, rhythmic, leans heavily on like repetition and repetitive forms, not in a way that gets boring, but it actually creates this kind of hypnotic pulse. And he spent a good deal of time in Africa before a huge chunk of the sort of Afrocentric revival appeared in the very late 60s, early 70s in the US. He was there before that, with Fela Kuti, before Fela Kuti became a huge name, with Guy Warren, the percussionist, who some of you may know as well. So yeah, fascinating character. And this is a great record. New Life Trio, Visions of the Third Eye. Okay, so here's a fun little private press record that I picked up in the last week or so, and this is from the bass player Mario Pavone. This record's called Digit, and this came out on his own label, Alcara Records. I think they only put out 8 or 9 records in total. And it's kind of private press, free music stuff out of New England. A lot of interesting music appearing out there at that time. On this record as well is the great kind of cult vibes leader Bobby Naughton, who only appeared on, less than 20 sessions himself. But he adds this like really ghost-like quality to this. His playing is like a more sparse out version of the way that, say, Bobby Hutcherson would play on Dolphy's Out to Lunch with those kind of angular lines. He has a little of that as well, but it's more restrained, I would say. It's not quite as busy. But Pavone, this is another one from the loft scene. You can sense a theme in my listening recently. Came up in that music. You hear it in his playing. A lot of those loft players, especially the guys on acoustic instruments, the double bass in particular, because a lot of these venues were, people's apartments. At that time, New York was certainly not the city it is today. And a lot of musicians were able to basically live in these lofts free of charge. The landlords would let them stay there basically as security for their own property, and they would basically be allowed to do what they wanted with the spaces. But many of them had minimal, if no, electricity, poor sanitation, running water. They were virtually slums, but there was a lot of amazing creative music came out of that scene. And what you find with a lot of the music that comes out of this is it's very stripped back, very DIY, and it's kind of in some ways back to the roots of the earlier forms of the music. So what I was getting to there with Mario Pavone is his bass style comes out of this scene whereby there really was often not much of a source for amplifiers for upright bass players, but he's playing with drummer, often, really aggressive sax players at that time. And in his technique, you hear this really fat, aggressive tone. Like he really pushes the bass hard. He had to be heard. So he's got this really muscular style, and compositionally really interesting as well. He talked a lot. I read an interview with him this week where he was talking about his joy of composing is in the grey areas between where music is improvised and where it's written, and he wants all of the music that he makes to live in that space. That's exactly what you hear on this record. It's right in that zone of, the improvisation has a melodic quality to it, even when it's on the freer end, where it could be written. It could be part of that AACM or new school sort of tightly written charts. But equally, what you think are the heads, the early parts of each of the tracks, also have this slightly unusual off-kilter quality to them, to the extent that you're not quite sure if they're freely improvised or not. But it's great. I really, really enjoyed this record. It's one I'm going to come back to a few times more. Because there's plenty in here, and anything with Bobby Naughton on it's worth a look. I think it's his record Understanding on Autic as well, which I have is really, really good as well. I dug that out this week, but I haven't listened to it yet. So well worth checking out if you can find a copy of this or anything by Mario Pavone. Played with the likes of Bill Dixon, Anthony Braxton as well. Check him out. Really cool stuff. Digit, Mario Pavone. Here's one from the 80s now, very late 80s, on the Silk Heart label. This is a record label that I've been kind of digging into a bit more recently. A lot of good stuff on it in the 80s, and there's a lot of great 80s records. Dig past the production in some of them, not in this one actually. I don't think this suffers from some of the production sounds, but there's a lot of really good stuff from the 1980s that hasn't quite been jumped on by people yet, so they're mercifully still affordable. So yeah, this is Dennis Gonzalez, trumpet and flugelhorn player, and his new Dallas Quartet. Also features John Purcell, primarily on the bass clarinet, who you may know from Jack DeJohnette's special edition records on ECM. And Henry Franklin on bass as well, who to me is actually the star of the show on this. His bass lines and his some of the inventiveness on his playing are really, really fantastic. But yeah, this is a nice session. It's not one that's necessarily going to change your life, but it's like a lot of the records on Silk Heart, they're pianoless, and they're all in that kind of post-ornette sphere of like exploring the freedom without a chordal instrument. So they lean a little bit heavier on bass vamps. I think that's why Franklin really stands out on here. But it's quite diverse, this session as well. It's not just all one note. There's one track dedicated to Don Cherry, which incorporates a bit of kalimba and balafon and a few other things. There's a little bit of synth work on this as well, in one track, which it actually is pretty tasteful. You know, I'm not a huge fan of weird synthesizers, but it actually works quite nicely on this. And there's a playfulness to this record that I really enjoy. And still a little hard edge there as well, so it's not too polite and austere, you know, which is good. But yeah, worth looking this up, worth checking out the label. There's some other great stuff from the likes of Charles Burkeen on Silk Heart, Ahmed Abdullah, who played with Sun Ra, he's got a couple of great records on the label. William Parker appears on a few of these. William Hooker as well. Yeah, a lot of interesting free or avant records on the label. And almost all of them, with a couple of exceptions, are still very, very affordable. So yeah, highly recommend anything on Silk Heart, and well worth looking up Dennis Gonzalez as well. Yeah, this record is Stefan. Okay, so I mentioned Don Cherry there, and here is a really enjoyable record of his actually, which only came out in Japan in the mid-70s. This is called Third World Underground, and it's a trio session with him, Dollar Brand on piano, and the pretty under-recorded Carlos Ward on alto sax. Carlos Ward, I mean, most notably, appears on a couple of sessions with Miles Davis in his electric period around the On the Corner era, and he's with Dollar Brand for a bit in the early 70s. This was recorded in it was the Café Montmartre in Copenhagen. So my guess for this session is I think Cherry at this point was living out in Denmark, out in the schoolhouse with Mocky Cherry, exploring a lot of the organic music that would come out on the likes of Organic Music Society, on Caprice, and the likes of Ankara, yeah, plenty of others on the Sonnet label. Actually, I can't remember the names of all of them off the top of my head, but my guess is that Dollar Brand and Carlos Ward were touring at the time and maybe were passing through Copenhagen, and they recorded this together because it sounds pretty spontaneous. It leans really, really heavily on Dollar Brand's compositions, and it's definitely, for anyone who knows Dollar Brand's music, it's in that really spiritual, soulful vein of South African high life music, very melodic, but quite, I was going to say repetitive, but that's maybe sounds a little bit negative, drone-like almost. Yeah, hypnotic maybe would be a better word. But it's an interesting blend of Dollar Brand's music at this time with some of Don Cherry's ideas. At this point, he's exploring a lot of the sort of suite-like compositions. If you think of like Complete Communion or Symphony for Improvisers a few years earlier on Blue Note, they're almost like episodic. So they're long tracks, but he'll cue certain moments and the band will change and move into some other completely different song on the fly. There's definitely some of that in here as well. The music's wonderfully positive, really uplifting. There's a bit of vocalizing from all three of them at times, which is really, really beautiful, actually. I think it slightly suffers from not having a bass player on it, if I'm honest. What you get as a result is Dollar Brand is using his left hand basically to pound out bass lines the whole time, but it just feels a little bit shackled as a result, but it's gorgeous music. Yeah, and it's a really, really great example of the powers of Brand and Cherry especially, but Carlos Ward too. He plays beautifully on this. Some really nice soaring playing on the alto. So yeah, worth checking out on YouTube, or if you can find a copy online or in stores as well, worth checking this out. Yeah, Don Cherry, Carlos Ward, and Dollar Brand, Third World Underground. Okay, so here is a really interesting private press record that I stumbled across via Instagram a month or two ago, and I've really been enjoying this. This is Tim White and Jack Gates, and this record is Morning Song, Evening Song. This came out on a label that these two musicians put together. It's called White Gates Records. I think this is the only album that came out on the label. And these two guys were childhood friends, really. They went to school and college together, and then they kind of went their separate ways. But they reconnected with one another at the Ali Akbar School of Music, actually. And this is it's a duo records, kind of combination of flute, guitar, a little bit of sitar as well. And it's just like a really wonderful, meditative music session, really. Kind of combination of like some progressive folk stuff, a little bit of new age music as well, but still very much acoustic new age, not so much of the synth stuff that you would find later on. And yeah, it's just a really, really, really nice fusing of Western ideas and some Hindustani classical music. I guess we were talking about Don Cherry before. This is in that same vein as like Cadona with Don Cherry, Nana Vasconcelos, and Colin Walcott. It sounds almost like a distant cousin, or not even a distant cousin, to be honest. A very familiar cousin of Cadona, or even some of the Oregon records. The Instagram post I saw of this described it as like a session that could easily have been on ECM, and I totally agree with that. But it's really, really great music, totally improvised, yeah, totally impressionistic, and yeah, just really pastoral music, I would say. A lot of the tracks have titles about the desert, the outdoors. I mean, you get the sense of these kind of vast outdoor spaces in this music. Or more specifically, you get the sense of the insignificance of human beings within vast outdoor spaces. That's what it sounds like to me. And the kind of joy and wonder within that. So this is well worth checking out too, as are all of these records. But yeah, this is a really interesting one. I've really been enjoying this the last month, and I highly recommend this to anyone who's interested in music of the likes of Don Cherry, Colin Walcott, Cadona. Well worth looking up. Yeah, Tim White, Jack Gates, Morning Song, Evening Song. All right, so last one from me for this video, and I've been really digging this for the last couple of months now. It's barely left the turntable, and this is John Tchicai. Fantastic record on MPS from 1969. This is Aphrodisiaca. John Tchicai, not as well known as he should be, born in Denmark, of Congolese descent. He has the misfortune, I would say, of being known as one of the other saxophone players on Ascension, which really does him a massive disservice. I think a lot of people think of him as the not Marion Brown alto player. But he's so much more than that, and his career is really interesting. I think one of the earliest videos I did here on the VC, I showed a really interesting album that he did with a Bulgarian group called the Binder Quintet, which was exploring like Eastern European music as it relates to jazz, and that's a really great session. There's a brilliant records called Tribal Ghosts as well from the early 2000s, which he's on along with Billy Hart, on No Business Records out of Lithuania, which is fantastic. And he's got some great records for Steeplechase as well. This, though, has him with this kind of large band format. And I did mention Ascension earlier. It is kind of in the vein of Ascension, but I would say I need to be careful what I say here. I think this is a more interesting record than Ascension. Ascension's obviously a fantastic record. It's a seminal record, both in John Coltrane's career and for the free jazz movement. But I think it's kind of a primitive example of what can be done with a large group format. And it's reflective of what it is. It's kind of that discovering what can be done with a group in the free format, following on from Ornette's ideas with the free jazz record. This is taking it to the next step for me. And primarily in that is the title track, Aphrodisiaca. You can see on the back here the size of the band. And the really interesting thing about this is it's taking a group of about 23 musicians, and it's using them to reinterpret a musical scale of the balafon, this African instrument. And so what you get over about 20 minutes is this hypnotic, kind of rhythmic, chordal exploration of this music in this way that creates this kind of bubbling trance under the music. And it sets this sort of rolling ocean for a few of the musicians to solo over. Tchicai's solo is this really haunting sound. And I need to mention as well, Hugh Steinmetz, who is the trumpeter on this. Firstly, his solo that leads off this track is unbelievable. It's just like heart-rendingly beautiful. But Aphrodisiaca is also his piece. So although it's credited to Tchicai, it's really him who has spearheaded this. And this track, just over 20 odd minutes, just grows and grows and grows. And by the end, it's just a full out free blowing session. And it's pure ecstasy. I've gotten properly lost in that side of this record. Yeah, so I would highly recommend checking this out for anyone who's interested in free music. It's really terrific. Yeah, so go check it out. That's John Tchicai, Aphrodisiaca. And yeah, that's almost half an hour, so that's definitely enough from me. Thank thank you for tuning in and for making it this far if you have. Please leave a comment. I'll do my best to reply. I'm hoping to try and reconnect a little more with people on here in the next few months. Now I have a bit more time at home. So yeah, please leave your comments, and yeah, I hope you're all doing well. Okay, thank you. Be well.